History and Philosophy of the Language Sciences podcast, online at hifilangsi.net. There you can find links and references to all the literature we discuss. In the previous episode, we looked at linguistic relativity, one of the key ideas associated with the American linguist Edward Sapir and his student Benjamin Lee Whorf. So much so, in fact, that this idea is often referred to under the name of the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. In this episode, we turn our attention to another leading American linguist of the early 20th century, Leonard Bloomfield. Bloomfield was in many ways Sapir's foil. Although Sapir and Bloomfield had many things in common, they had fairly major differences of opinion about the fundamentals of language. While Sapir took what we might want to describe as a humanistic approach to language, Bloomfield had a much more scientistic attitude. This contrast is illustrated nicely in an anecdote from the anthropologist Charles Vogelin, who had known both Sapir and Bloomfield personally. Sapir, Vogelin said, spoke deprecatingly of Bloomfield's sophomoric psychology, while Bloomfield referred to Sapir as a medicine man. Let's now have a look at Bloomfield's sophomoric psychology. This is a reference to Bloomfield's adherence to the psychological school of behaviourism. Behaviourism shaped the scientific outlook of Bloomfield's mature work. Bloomfield not only framed his theories in behaviourist terms, but also took his cue from behaviourists in formulating justifications for linguistic research. The psychological school of behaviourism arose in the period of foundational conflict that accompanied the institutionalization of psychology as an academic discipline around the turn of the 19th to the 20th century. We briefly surveyed the chief competing schools of this period back in episode 21, when we looked at the work of Karl Bühler. The trademark of behaviourism, setting it apart from other schools in this period, was an uncompromising empiricism. A central article of faith in almost every other psychological school at this time was that psychology is the science of the human mind, or psyche. The task of the psychologist should therefore be to investigate what goes on inside the human mind, generally by employing the method of introspection, where the researcher reflects on their own thoughts. The behaviourists, however, rejected any talk of what might be going on invisibly inside people's heads. The psychologist argued the behaviourists can only appeal to the observable external manifestations of mental activity, namely behaviour. Introducing the term behaviourism in his 1913 manifesto, Psychology as the Behaviourist Views It, the American psychologist John B. Watson summarized the approach with the following words. He said, "Psychology as the behaviourist views it is a purely objective branch of natural science. Its theoretical goal is the prediction and control of behaviour. Introspection forms no essential part of its methods, nor is the scientific value of its data dependent on the readiness with which they lend themselves to interpretation in terms of consciousness. The behaviourist, in his effort to get a unitary scheme of animal response, recognizes no dividing line between man and brute. The behaviour of man, with all its refinement and complexity, forms only a part of the behaviourist's total scheme of investigation." For centuries it had been assumed that there's a qualitative difference between humans and animals. Humans have free will, while animals seem only to react reflexively to stimuli. The classical formulation of this position came from the philosopher René Descartes, whose work helped to instigate the Enlightenment. Descartes argued that humans have souls granting them free will, while animals lack souls, making their behaviour entirely mechanistic. Strict behaviourists negated this position, asserting that neither humans nor animals have a mind or soul. The higher-order functions of humans are just more elaborate sequences of mechanistic reactions to stimuli. To demonstrate a causal connection between a specific stimulus and a response, behaviourists typically devised experiments to condition or train their subjects, whether animal or human, to react in a certain way to a particular stimulus. A notorious example is the Little Albert experiment conducted by John B. Watson and his then graduate student, Rosalie Rayner. Watson and Rayner trained a baby, known as Albert B., to have a fear reaction to cute, furry things. Over several experimental sessions, little Albert was presented with a rat, which he reached out to touch. But as soon as Albert touched the rat, a metal bar was struck behind his head to produce a loud, scary noise that upset him. After several weeks in which this conditioning procedure was repeated, it was found that Albert would immediately respond with fear to the sight of the rat, without any sound being made. Albert extended this fear response to other furry creatures and objects, such as a rabbit, a dog, a fur coat, cotton wool, and a Santa Claus mask with beard. He did not react negatively to other non-furry stimuli, however, such as toy blocks. The process of conditioning not only served the purpose of proving connections between stimulus-reaction pairs, but was also an instrument for regulating behavior. As we heard in the quotation from Watson a moment ago, a key goal of behaviorism was to control behavior. This goal was part of the ethos of the social sciences in this era, especially in the United States. American society at this time was undergoing massive changes, with increasing industrialization, urbanization, and immigration. In order to master the challenges presented by these changes, professional elites in America embarked on programs of rational social reform in a movement that's generally referred to as progressivism. Proponents of progressivism believed that, given the right opportunities and guidance, every man, woman, and child could acquire the necessary skills and moral virtues required to be a productive, upstanding member of society. Social scientists, not least among them psychologists, eagerly aligned themselves with progressivist aspirations. Conditioning was marketed as a technique for effectively raising children, correcting deviancy, or simply improving the behavior of the average citizen. In a 1926 article in Harper's Magazine, a journal with a general middle-class readership, Watson envisaged a future where behaviorism, quote, may be able to help the home, the school, the church, society to bring up a socialized but individual human product. Bloomfield's conversion to behaviorism was a result of his contact with Albert Paul Weiss, a leading behaviorist and a colleague of Bloomfield's at the University of Ohio. One of the earliest expressions of Bloomfield's behaviorism was in his 1926 paper, Postulates for a Science of Language. In this paper, Bloomfield defined meaning in language as, quote, a recurrent stimulus-reaction feature which corresponds to a form, casting his account of language in behaviorist terms. Bloomfield's postulates were inspired by Weiss's 1925 paper, One Set of Postulates for Behavioristic Psychology. Weiss aimed in his paper to outline axioms underlying behaviorist psychology, just as Bloomfield sought to do for linguistics in his 1926 paper. The comprehensiveness of Bloomfield's conversion to behaviorism is most striking when we compare the two introductory books on linguistics that he wrote in the course of his career. The first of these, the 1914 Introduction to the Study of Language, more or less emulated neo-grammarian approaches to psychology. Bloomfield gestured towards the writings of Wilhelm Wundt as a basis for his psychology. We've discussed the neo-grammarian's complex attitude to Wundt in previous episodes. Bloomfield's second introductory book, however, the 1933 Language, is thoroughly behaviorist. In illustrating the nature of language, for example, Bloomfield sketched the following hypothetical scene. He wrote, suppose Jack and Jill are walking down a lane. Jill is hungry. She sees an apple in a tree. She makes a noise with her larynx, tongue, and lips. Jack vaults the fence, climbs the tree, takes the apple, brings it to Jill, and places it in her hand. Jill eats the apple. Bloomfield continued, Jill's state of hunger and the sight or smell of the food are the stimulus. If Jill had been alone, then her reaction may have been to move towards the food. But in the presence of Jack, Jill's reaction was to produce noises, that is, to use language, which in turn served as a stimulus to Jack, causing him to actualize the action of securing the food. Bloomfield concluded, Jack performed the actions that were beyond Jill's strength, and in the end, Jill got the apple. Language enables one person to make a reaction when another person has the stimulus. The division of labour, and with it the whole working of human society, is due to language. Bloomfield's scenario not only reveals an intriguing 1930s conception of gender roles, but also assimilates language to behaviourist sequences of stimulus and reaction. On this account, language is simply a means for extending these sequences and distributing them across individuals. We might also observe that Bloomfield's physiological description of Jill's speech as making a noise with her larynx, tongue, and lips is reminiscent of the materialist or monist terms in which August Schleicher conceived of language, which we talked about back in episode 5. These parallels are no coincidence. The behaviourists were in many ways the heirs to scientific materialism and Comtean positivism in their banishment of the mind and soul and worship of the natural sciences. Bloomfield's adherence to behaviourism extended to adopting behaviourist fantasies of controlling people to create rational agents in a well-ordered society. In a 1929 address on Linguistics as a Science, Bloomfield touted linguistics as the willing servant of the progressivist agenda. He said, "I believe that in the near future, in the next few generations, let us say, linguistics will be one of the main sectors of scientific advance, and that in this sector science will win through to the understanding and control of human conduct. In the domains of physics and biology, science has for some time been working with success and has given us great power. In the domain of anthropology, that is, in the study of man's superbiological activities, science has been unsuccessful." The truth of this contrast and its tragic import appear plainly in the fact that our achievements in non-human science do us little good, because we cannot understand or control their human consequences. We make powerful engines, but we have no way of deciding who is to use them, and we have seen them used for our destruction. We can prevent suffering and widen the scope of life, but the fruition of these, our powers, is disturbed by such means as the hazards of gambling. The positivistic attitude animating Bloomfield's behaviourism was widespread in the early 20th century and found expression in the doctrines of many different schools. The most prominent articulation of this attitude as an explicit philosophy of science was made in the logical positivism, also known as logical empiricism, of the Vienna Circle. In the 1930s, Bloomfield came into contact with leading members of the Vienna Circle and found in their ideas confirmation and reinforcement of many of the positions to which he had already been led by behaviourism. The Vienna Circle was an academic discussion group, most active in Vienna in the late 1920s and early 1930s, dedicated to the task of securing the epistemological foundations of modern science. Through this work, the Circle became one of the central locations at which early analytic philosophy was incubated, alongside the Cambridge of Bertrand Russell and Ludwig Wittgenstein. The most vocal members of the Vienna Circle did not view their philosophy as a purely academic project, but sought to, quote, fashion tools of thought for the everyday, as they put it in their 1929 manifesto. They presented a public image of the Circle as a socially engaged collective devoted to combating metaphysics by furthering the scientific world conception. In the parlance of the Circle, the scientific world conception referred to the understanding of the world imparted to us by modern science, while metaphysics was a label, practically reduced to a slur, for all traditional philosophy. The Vienna Circle was therefore invested in making an intellectual intervention for the improvement of society on rational lines, and in this way was very similar to progressivism in the United States. The signature doctrine of the Vienna Circle in the 1930s was physicalism, a position that coalesced in a debate between the Circle members Otto Neurath and Rudolf Carnap. The classical exposition of the theory is Carnap's 1931 paper, The Physical Language as the Universal Language of Science. At the heart of physicalism is the notion of the physical language. This is the language of the scientific discipline of physics, the key feature of which is that it talks about things in the world in a way that is both mathematically precise and independent of the perceptions of any individual. Any statement in the physical language can be verified, that is, tested for its truth, by translating it into a protocol language, a language that describes the experiences of an individual observer. There are as many of these protocol languages as there are observers. Furthermore, a statement in the sub-language of any genuine science, so chemistry, biology, psychology, sociology, and so on, can be translated into the physical language. It's this possibility of translation that both guarantees the scientific validity of these sub-languages and the unity of science, the underlying coherence of these patchwork disciplines in capturing one common reality. Metaphysical statements, by contrast, cannot be translated into the physical language, and are therefore nonsense from a scientific perspective. In another paper, his 1931 The Elimination of Metaphysics Through Logical Analysis of Language, Carnap gave the example of the metaphysical proposition das Nichts selbst nichtet, that is, the nothing itself nothings. This is a phrase that was made famous by the contemporary German philosopher Martin Heidegger. It's impossible to translate this phrase into logically correct language, wrote Carnap. As such, the phrase is meaningless in the strictest sense. It contains merely an expression of a Lebensgefühl, or an attitude to life. Bloomfield embraced the physicalism of the Vienna Circle, although he claimed to see in it nothing more than a confirmation of his existing behaviourism. In his 1935 presidential address to the Linguistic Society of America, Language or Ideas, Bloomfield stated that Carnap and Neurath had arrived at much the same insights as Albert Paul Weiss and other behaviourists. The only scientific way to talk about the world, including human thought, is in physical terms. A linguist informed by behaviourism, argued Bloomfield, has a key role to play in the elaboration and testing of physicalism, since the linguist can show how woolly, unscientific terms like ideas can be reformulated in a rigorous physicalist jargon. He said, "Non-linguists, unless they happen to be physicalists, constantly forget that a speaker is making noise, and credit him instead with the possession of palpable ideas. It remains for linguists to show, in detail, that the speaker has no ideas, and that the noise is sufficient, for the speaker's words act with a trigger effect upon the nervous systems of his speech fellows. Linguists, then, will have to read the description of the universe as men have written it, and wherever they come upon the mention of an idea, or any synonym such as concept, notion, or the like, they will have to replace this mention by terms relating to language." Shortly after delivering this address, Bloomfield and Carnap became colleagues at the University of Chicago. As was the fate of so many European scholars and intellectuals in this period, most of the leading members of the Vienna Circle, including Carnap and Neurath, were driven out of Central Europe by the rise of fascism. While on a lecture tour of the United States in 1935, Carnap decided not to return to Europe and took up a position in Chicago in 1936. In the following years, Bloomfield collaborated directly with Carnap and Neurath on the International Encyclopedia of Unified Science. Spearheaded by Neurath, the Encyclopedia was an attempt to realize the project of the unity of science by bringing together scientists from disparate disciplines to outline the scope and tools of their respective fields and to show how these fitted into the total ensemble of the sciences. Bloomfield contributed an article to the 1938 first volume of the Encyclopedia on linguistic aspects of science, in which he laid out his now familiar behaviourist account of language. Here he pointed out the centrality of language to the modern sciences. His argument was essentially that scientific statements must always be made in a language, even if it might be the highly restricted and specialized languages of mathematics and logic. Bloomfield eagerly embedded his linguistics in the philosophical frameworks provided by behaviourism and logical positivism, adopting not only their theoretical positions, but aligning the role and purpose of linguistics with their rhetoric. These frameworks provided support for the formalist model of language study that Bloomfield had developed. In the next episode, we'll look at this formalist model and at the similarities between Bloomfield's positions and those of Sapir, despite the underlying differences in their approaches.